All right, lastly, we want to wrap up just one last kind of definition and some final thoughts on partition and division and arrangement here, and then we'll let you get to work on this assignment and finishing up your next chapter in Office of Assertion, finalizing your senior thesis topic, and that'll be, plenty of work for this week here. Okay, so one last, definition that we won't be doing in class since you need a lot of resource tools to work on to do it is the etymological definition, right? Etymology, you use that, I'm sure, a few times in your life. The etymon is from the Greek, the original meaning, as you said, ology, logos, study of, words about, right? So for etymology, you break a word into its parts and then study each part's meaning and its history, like we just did with a definition of the word etymology itself, right? So this is a really popular thing. It was for a long time before internet and before online dictionaries. Going through actual physical dictionaries and looking at all sorts of terms and meanings. Still, possible to do, of course, with a real dictionary, but it can be kind of distracting and sidetracking. So, the limiting aspect of the etymological definition is it assumes that, as you can see, the original meaning or the earlier use of this term is more accurate than how it is used now, right? And certainly, in the English language and the world we live in today, we know a lot of terms are changing and going through quite a bit of revision all the time. And it always has been that way, so it's not something new in our day. It's always been that way, but there are probably a couple of terms and words that you can, that are still sort of standout words in the terms of it used to mean one thing for a long, long time, and now more recently it's meant something else. Now, certainly, then you have to sort of decide, is this a battle that I really want to fight? And do I want to use this term how it has been used, depending on your audience, of course, how they know it, how other people I speak to and other sort of peers or whatever might use this term. It's always changing, and words are always, changing their usage and things like that. So it's not, for the most part, it's not a big deal, but certainly for some, depending on, certainly as a Christian, there are certainly some concepts, some ideas that you are going to define one way, and other people, maybe not your audience for this thesis itself, but in the years ahead, other people that you meet and know and encounter are going to be using some of those terms in drastically different ways from how you, as a conservative, not politically, but just as a sort of traditional Christian with more traditional values, you might, certainly more biblical grounded values, I would hope, would use some concepts and conceive of some terms. So again, you're going to have to determine, is this battle worth fighting? How am I going to define this term? Use a more older use of this term or definition, or more current kinds of things. So there are certainly lots of tools out there for finding and original, older uses of terms. It can be an enjoyable sort of process, but there's some words that mean today like the exact opposite of what they meant not that long ago. Like a less politically charged term like the word moot, M-O-O-T. Right? Not that long ago, the word moot meant to discuss an issue. Right now, you hear it used like that's a moot point. People are just dismissing it and saying, well, it's not worth talking about. So somehow over the last couple of decades, the word moot has gone from, something that you talk about to something you don't talk about. So an exact 180 degree, shift in usage there for a simple term. So and that has not been, centuries in the process. It's just been, just a few generations of using it one way, misusing it, and then things like that. So it's not always a big sort of cultural, moral problem in going to older definitions of terms, but sometimes it could be worth investigating, but it might not be, and of course depends on the terms that you're using and the topic itself. So there's etymological definition, right? And lastly is this concept, as you said, of partition and division. We talk about this quite a bit, right? You're defining your terms, dividing them up into parts, and that is what you're doing with your partition. You're naming all the arguments that you're going to be using in your confirmation, naming all the concise arguments you're going to be refuting in the refutation. And so, as you divide up arguments and show the parts and the pieces of them, you can, especially when you're refuting different kinds of arguments, you look at the specific ideas that people use in their arguments and their proofs. If you can eliminate some parts as false, then the whole premise for what they believe is false, things like that. So this concept of division and arranging your ideas and looking at the arrangement of other people's ideas can be a very useful tool in instead of taking large chunks of information or arguments and proofs and like that, divide them up into more smaller, manageable things, and then look at their truthfulness, their untruthfulness, things like that. Eliminate what is not important, focus on the good things like that. So, and that is something that you're going to be doing with your thesis itself. Instead of just going on and on and on, rambling about how great this idea is and everybody should believe it, you're going to chop it up into manageable parts, manageable confirmation arguments, and prove X, Y, Z one at a time using a whole lots of logical proofs and emotional proofs, ethical proofs, lots of extrinsic proofs, and statistics and quotations from all sorts of sources. And you divide up your thesis into manageable parts, and then it'll be an easy thing to write about and rewrite about and things like that. So division, a very helpful sort of sophistic topic of organizing your ideas into manageable sizes, and also manageable way to interact with opposing arguments like that. Okay, so an important idea there as we start to wrap this up. Right. So classification, generalization, these are sort of the last ideas here of sophistic topics. Again, genus, species reasoning. What's true of the whole is true of the part, right? And so that's where the importance of definition and avoiding ambiguity is important in all sorts of aspects of life, not just in sort of abstract notion of writing a thesis and defending it, but all sorts of proper human interaction and legal forensic type of rhetoric as well, right? In a sort of ambiguously written will, the husband left amount of silver to the wife, right? But especially in Virginia, that the Commonwealth of Virginia is very particular about specific things in wills and estates and things like that. If it's not specifically listed out directly, then it could be snatched up by the government. So is this silver coin, silver tableware, silver candlesticks, what is it? You have to understand the specifics of the species to understand this relationship and classification. Generalization can be helpful, but sometimes you need specific classification to make your point and your arrangement of ideas more understandable. Okay, a slightly more negative topic, hate speech and things like that. Other sorts of politically charged things that always seem to be popular in the news today. Accidental, purposeful, things like that. Obviously, you might think, well, is this ever an accidental sort of thing? But a bunch of buddies getting together and making jokes at one another's expense, overheard by somebody, could be taken the wrong way, and suddenly this conversation and the situation has gone in an entirely different direction than what it was intended. So classification of terms and understanding situations, knowing your audience, all those are important things when you're classifying and dividing up arguments and using terms. Obviously, you're as Christians, you want to always be kind and aware of how you're speaking to other people. But it's just sort of a general example that the law courts are filled with all sorts of terms and things like that. So one last thought here: similarity, comparison. As you do the sophistic topics of compare, contrast, cause and effect, the effectiveness of your comparisons is going to be in not just the implications, but how you explicitly make those comparisons for your audience, right? You've heard the term, you can't compare, or the expression, can't compare apples and oranges. Well, there might be times when you look at comparing or contrasting similar sorts of things and just looking at the particular ways that they're different or the way they overlap, and sort of like a Venn diagram, sort of a verbal Venn diagram, right? Can be helpful, right? There are some situations that making those broad generalizations and comparisons, like New York City is like Los Angeles because they're both cities, right? Well, the people who live in those big cities would be, horrified and outraged that you would compare them to either end, because probably even better than I do that people who live in one prefer to live in that one and not the other one for many reasons. And so, citizens of New York City would not want to be compared to citizens of Los Angeles, because of a whole lots of cultural and subcultural reasons there. So you, as a rhetor, certainly want to make your comparisons and the reasons why you're drawing these comparisons specific and explicit. You leave too much implied, then your audience might take these analogies, take these comparisons in directions that you did not want them to go in. Okay, so as you use different and similar sorts of ideas, as you compare and contrast, be specific and be overt for the most part. Okay, sometimes they can go from greater to lesser, and use sort of inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning that way. And there are a lot of ways that you can use implications as well, especially if they're specific examples and specific comparisons can be effective if you are leading your audience in the right direction. So there's only really one conclusion that they can draw from your obvious implications. Okay, so examining differences between similar things, looking at the differences between apples and oranges can be interesting, but possibly unfruitful. So, watch out that your audience, as we said, doesn't go in the direction that you don't want them to go in. Okay, look at contraries, look at opposites. Don't always look at ways that or particulars that are too similar and maybe too obviously similar. Remember the classical world that looks at the opposites of emotions and things like that. When you looked at pathos, and those are the Bible and Book of Proverbs. And then reading through that lately, not to show off, just But the Book of Proverbs, is replete with looking at these opposites, right? Don't be like this, be this kinds of person instead. Looking at opposites, especially as ways of concluding your thesis. I've taught you, I've showed you this, all these sorts of bad things. Here's what you can do instead. Look at this opposite sort of lifestyle. Look at this opposite sort of action that we can do. Opposite policies instead of what we have right now. Lots of ways that driven by this stasis theory, as we said, finding the same argument, as you said, abortion. Contraries of pro-life. It's not contraries. It's not meaningful definition and division of arguments. And so they're the pro-life and pro-choice camps are not fighting the same battle at the same time. So they're not in stasis. They're not dividing the same arguments, things like that. So you want to avoid all those things. And so as you divide your arguments, arrange them in meaningful ways, use, compare, contrast, and you draw specific and meaningful conclusions for your audience, or lead them where you want them to go with your comparisons, with your contrast. Use clear definitions of terms, divide up your arguments into meaningful and yet concise, workable chunks or groups there, and then this thesis will be an enjoyable experience for you and your audience, not just me reading it. So there are some extended thoughts there on sophistic topics of whole part relationships, genus-species relationships, definitions and divisions of terms here, and that will draw our time with arrangement to a little bit of a conclusion here. Keep, as you said, finish that chapter, work on the definition terms task, finalize your thesis, and we'll head into second quarter ready to go. All right. So that is it for arrangement. We will see you pretty soon with style and some other shorter videos here, but that ends our last lengthy PowerPoint slideshow, and hope it's been a somewhat helpful experience for you having these video talk-throughs, and hopefully the information has been helpful, and we'll see you in a new way, different way here for second quarter. All right. So long.